In 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. It caused a global economic catastrophe that would last until World War II. 13 million people lost their jobs, and hundreds of thousands were evicted. Many Americans learned what it meant to be poor and afraid. Even at the height of the Depression, tens of thousands of Americans crowded theaters each week. Musicals and visions of individualism and success captivated audiences who, for at least a few hours, could escape their desperate lives. Despite box office success, movie studios felt the Depression's effects. They slashed salaries to avoid closing theaters and laying off staff. Film industry workers organized unions or guilds to negotiate workers' rights, wages, and working conditions. In many guilds, the Communist Party was actively involved. Some Americans, disillusioned by capitalism and the failure of the banks, looked to communism and socialism as alternatives for dealing with crippling poverty, social inequality, and the global threat of fascism. Communist Party membership grew during the Great Depression. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide Democratic victory. To improve the economy and avoid future collapses, FDR introduced progressive regulatory changes, Social Security, and widespread public works projects. The New Deal included controversial measures for collective bargaining, welfare, housing, infrastructure, and trade. These programs gained traction among liberals, but many Republicans feared New Deal programs would move America towards communism. The Great Depression shook the world. Fascism took hold in Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain. In the U.S., concerned congressional leaders created an investigative committee to explore fascism in the U.S., and later expanded the committee's work to include communism. In 1938, the committee became known as the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC. HUAC investigated suspected fascist or communist actions carried out by private citizens, public employees, and organizations. In 1941, the work of HUAC was put on hold. The Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. 6 months later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The entire world was gripped by war. The US and the USSR were allied against the Axis powers. Hollywood was drafted into the war effort. Filmmakers were positioned into the Office of War Information, and the US government began co-editing Hollywood features to ensure movies like Mission to Moscow showed Soviet allies in a positive light. The war ended with the explosion of 2 nuclear bombs over Japanese cities, unleashing unprecedented destruction. At home, the fear of nuclear war changed the way Americans felt about their security. Geographic isolation no longer carried the same assurance when one bomb could obliterate an entire city. The end of the war dissolved the alliance with the Soviet Union, and the fear of communism resurged. For many foreign policymakers, communism seemed to be a tidal wave ready to sweep the world. Eastern Europe became a communist stronghold. By the end of the decade, China, North Vietnam, and North Korea fell under communist control. Fearful of communist expansion and nuclear war, the U.S. became infatuated with a doctrine of containment, according to which communism was a political and cultural contagion that needed to be isolated at all costs. In 1946, conservatives took control of the House and Senate and began applying the doctrine of containment inside the United States. With this mindset, any expression in art or film that seemed to sympathize with socialism or communism was considered a subversion, an un-American cultural infection that needed to be sanitized. HUAC resumed its work, turning its gaze to Hollywood. It started investigating potential communist subversion in film. Films that showed the Soviet Union as an ally, films previously endorsed and co-produced by the Office of War Information, were now viewed as enemy propaganda. Writers, actors, and directors were subpoenaed to testify at hearings. Those who refused were charged with contempt of Congress. Movie studios, which had been riding high during the war years, were suddenly beleaguered by violent labor disputes, the advent of television, and a case challenging their antitrust status. When pressed by Congress and vocal anti-communists, the studio heads caved, firing those who were suspected communists, starting an industry-wide blacklist. Fear dominated post-World War II America. Fear of Soviet takeover, fear of corporate losses, fear of nuclear annihilation. What happens when fear becomes the motivation for policy, for employment, and for how we relate to each other? Using the politics of fear, the blacklist continued for more than a decade. HUAC was formally terminated in 1975.